For 11 years, nobody in Boston's North End had set foot on the 3 stone steps in front of the Ferraro house. The staff didn't. The family didn't. The men who'd worked for that name since before Elias Ferraro was born didn't either. Everybody used the side entrance. And nobody ever said why out loud. Because everybody already knew. Elias was 33 years old. He'd run the family since he was 22. He owned restaurants, a trucking company, a piece of the waterfront, and 400 people fed their kids off his payroll. Men twice his age lowered their voices when he walked into a room. And in 11 years, he hadn't once used his own front door. So when his car pulled up at 2 a.m. on a wet night in March, and the headlights swept across that step, and there was somebody lying on it, his driver had a hand inside his coat before the engine even shut off. Elias raised one hand. Nobody move. She was young, maybe 27, curled against the stone column with her knees drawn up and a red delivery bag still clutched to her chest. Like even in her sleep, she was afraid somebody would take it from her. Her sneakers had split open at the toe. Her jacket was soaked straight through. She didn't know whose house she'd fallen asleep in front of. She didn't know that the man standing over her in the rain could erase a person from every dock in Massachusetts with a single phone call, and that he'd done it before. Elias stood there and looked at her for a long time. He could have had somebody wake her. He could have left cash on the step and put her in a car, and that's exactly what a man like him was supposed to do. Instead, he did something that made every man standing behind him go completely still. He climbed the steps, and he opened the front door. If stories like this one stay with you, hit that like button, share it with somebody who could use it tonight, and subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. Now let's go back to that rainy step in Boston, and find out what happens when a man who buried his own front door finally opens it. The sound of the door opening jolted her awake. Maeve Sullivan sat upright in an instant, her back hitting the stone pillar, both hands gripping the delivery bag as if it were the only thing keeping her connected to the world. She looked at the man standing on the steps, looked at the 3 men standing behind him in the rain, and immediately started apologizing. She apologized for sleeping there. She apologized for causing trouble. She apologized because the order was cold, and she held the bag out in front of her the way someone would hold out identification at a checkpoint, as if he only needed to see it to understand that she wasn't a thief. He didn't take it. She kept talking, faster now, her words stumbling over each other, saying he shouldn't pay, saying she would deduct it from her own wages, saying the delivery company had rules about late orders, and she was used to dealing with that. Then she stood up, and she swayed slightly because her legs had gone numb, and she said she was leaving now. She made it exactly 7 steps to where her car was parked outside the gate. She turned the key. Nothing happened. She turned it again. Still nothing. Maeve sat inside the dark car, both hands resting on the steering wheel, and for one moment she couldn't think of anything at all. This wasn't the first time the car had failed to start, but it was the first time it had happened somewhere she wasn't supposed to be. She heard footsteps on the gravel. The man was standing beside the car door, and he bent down to look at her through the rain-covered glass, and he didn't say a word about where she had slept. He only asked if she had eaten anything. That question caught in her throat harder than if he had yelled. Sal Marchetti stood at the edge of the porch and watched everything. He had served the Ferraro name since before Elias had learned how to walk. He had seen many things inside this house. But when Elias turned back, leading the woman carrying the red delivery bag, and when the 2 of them walked through the open front door, Sal froze in place as if he had just witnessed something that couldn't possibly be real. He was about to speak. He saw the look on Elias's face and said nothing. Rosa Bianchi was woken just before 3 a.m, and she didn't ask a single question. She simply looked at the soaked young woman standing quietly at the edge of the hallway, looked at the worn-out shoes leaving watermarks across the floor, and then walked straight to the kitchen. 10 minutes later, the long dining table had been prepared. Maeve stood at the entrance of the dining room and didn't dare step inside. She said she could sit in the kitchen. She said she could sit outside on the porch. Elias pulled out the chair at the head of the table and said nothing, only stood there, and eventually she walked in and sat down, both hands resting on her lap like a child waiting in a hospital room. Elias sat in the chair across from her. He didn't eat. He didn't pour himself anything. He simply sat there, elbows resting on the wooden surface, and watched. Maeve began eating very slowly. She ate the way someone who had once been taught proper manners would eat. Someone who had once had a mother reminding her about her elbows and telling her to chew carefully. She placed her knife down between every bite. She wiped her mouth. She said thank you twice. And then there was a moment, somewhere around the 3rd or 4th bite, when something inside her broke. She ate faster, then faster still. Then she stopped putting the knife down. She ate like someone who had gone hungry for so long that her body no longer listened to her mind, And halfway through the meal, she stopped, lifted a hand to cover her face, and apologized in a voice that cracked in two. She said she wasn't like this. She said she hadn't always been like this. Elias didn't say anything. He didn't hand her a towel. He didn't say it was okay. He simply sat there and let her have that silence, because he understood something very few people understood, that sometimes comforting someone only makes them feel more ashamed. When she lowered her hand, her eyes red but dry, he finally spoke, and his voice was completely ordinary, as if he were talking about the weather. He said it had been 11 years since anyone had sat at that table. He said he still ate standing in the kitchen. Maeve looked up at him. Outside, the rain continued tapping against the porch roof. Inside that long dining room, two strangers sat at opposite ends of a table that neither of them felt they belonged to, and neither of them knew that night had just opened the beginning of something that all of Boston would soon be talking about. He let her finish eating before he asked. He asked how long she had been sleeping outside. Maeve answered immediately, neatly and smoothly, like a sentence she had practiced, saying it had only been a few days, saying her place was being repaired, saying it would be finished next week. She said it while looking down at the table. Elias didn't argue. He didn't tell her she was lying. He simply let her answer sit in the room for a while, long enough for her to hear how empty it sounded herself, and then he asked again. This time his voice was much softer, almost quiet, and he didn't ask how many more days. He asked how long it had really been. Maeve stayed silent for a long time. Then she said 9 weeks. She said the number in exactly the same tone someone would use to read a string of numbers from a bill. No trembling, no emphasis. Elias didn't ask another question. She was the one who continued, and she spoke the way someone speaks after telling the same story so many times that it no longer hurts in the same place. Her mother was sick for a long time. The final 6 months were spent in the hospital, and there was a paper she had to sign with her mother, and she signed, because at that moment there were only the two of them in the room, and the hospital needed one more signature. She said when her mother died, that paper didn't disappear with her. It stayed with Maeve. She said she had a younger sister, Poppy. The girl had been in an accident not long ago and was now at a rehabilitation center, learning how to walk again from the beginning, and every month there was a payment due, and for the past 2 years, she hadn't missed a single one. Elias asked what she used to do. Maeve said she was an accountant. Her voice changed slightly when she said that, not with pride, but with something smaller. Something like a person mentioning an old house they once lived in. She said she worked for a real estate company, worked there for several years, and they valued her. Then one day someone handed her a file and told her to adjust a few things. Just a few things. She said no. 2 weeks later, she received a termination letter, along with a very polite recommendation letter. So polite that no one in the industry dared hire her afterward. She said she applied everywhere. By the time she reached the dozens, she stopped counting. Then she lost her place to live, and she started delivering orders, and a car was both her way to earn money and her place to sleep. So in a way it was convenient. She said that last part with a very small smile, and that smile was the hardest thing to look at all night. Her phone was lying on the table, the screen still lit because she had just plugged it in to charge. Elias glanced at it without meaning to, and he saw a long note open on the screen, filled with names. He assumed it was a list of regular customers, the people who tipped well, something anyone in delivery work would keep track of to know where to go. He asked if it was a list of customers who left tips. Maeve looked down at the screen and shook her head. She said it was the people who said thank you to her. She said some days she delivered dozens of orders, and not a single person said a word. People opened the door, took the food, closed the door, and some didn't even look at her face. So whenever someone said thank you, she wrote down their name, the building, and the floor. And at night, she would read the list. She said she knew it was a little strange. Elias said nothing. He sat there in a silence much longer than all the others before it, and inside his mind something was slowly turning over, something he hadn't found a name for yet. Then he asked her a question he hadn't intended to ask. He asked if she regretted refusing them, if she regretted what happened because of that file. Maeve lifted her eyes and looked directly at him, and for the first time all night, there wasn't a trace of apology in her voice. She said not for a single second. Elias nodded very slightly. He stood up, told her there was a room on the right side of the hallway, that the door had an inside lock, and that someone would look at her car in the morning. Then he walked out without waiting for her to thank him, because he knew if he stayed, she would thank him, and he didn't want to hear another word of gratitude from that woman tonight. Sal waited until the sound of the living room door closing faded before he grabbed Elias by the elbow and pulled him into the kitchen. On the kitchen wall, directly above the sink, hung an old wooden plaque, its color faded with age. The words carved by hand in Italian, placed there by Elias's grandmother back when this house didn't even have electricity. No one who came to this house was ever supposed to leave with an empty stomach. Sal stood directly beneath it, and he didn't look up. He said, "Do you know what you just did?" Elias said he did. Sal said, "No, you don't." Then he said the thing that no one in this house had spoken out loud for 11 years. He said Elias's father had fallen on those steps. He said from that night until now, no one in the house had walked up those 3 stone steps. Not because there was a rule, but because no one could bear it. He said even Rosa went around to the side entrance to water the plants on the front porch. He said Elias was the last person he would have expected to open that door, and he opened it for a strange woman he knew absolutely nothing about. Elias leaned against the edge of the kitchen counter, arms crossed, and he let Sal finish. Sal said if he wanted to help, then help, but there was a way to do it. Give her enough money to rent a place for a few months, call a car to take her away, have someone repair her vehicle tomorrow and return it to her. Clean, respectful, no one owing anyone anything. She would leave before sunrise, and no one in North End would ever know what happened tonight. Elias listened. When Sal finished, he stayed silent for a long time. Then he said, "That isn't kindness." He said, "That's the cheapest way out." Sal asked what the difference was. Elias said the difference was that giving someone money was a way to stop yourself from having to think about them anymore. Sal had no answer for that. Elias said he wanted Sal to investigate her. 5 days. Everything. Sal asked what happened after 5 days. Elias said they would decide then. During those 5 days, Maeve stayed in the room on the right side of the hallway, sleeping more than she had slept in the previous 2 months combined, and every morning she asked Rosa if there was anything that needed to be done, and every morning Rosa told her no. On the 5th day, Sal placed a thin file on Elias's desk. He read from it in the steady voice of a man who had done this kind of work for decades. No criminal record, no gambling debts, no connection to anyone in the city worth noticing. There was a medical debt shared under her name with her deceased mother, large enough that Sal paused for half a second before continuing. There was a younger sister in a rehabilitation center, and there was one final line that Sal read in a completely different tone, saying she had been blacklisted from the accounting industry, with no company in the city willing to hire her, after leaving her previous workplace under circumstances recorded as failure to cooperate. Sal closed the file and said, "You see," he said, "they already stamped her." He said, "The entire industry avoids her." "Why do you think they avoid her?" Elias didn't pick up the file. He only looked at Sal and said, "You just said she was fired because she refused to falsify the books." He said, "Listen to the sentence you just said." Sal opened his mouth, then closed it again. He stood there in the office, a man who had lived in that world long enough to forget that sometimes the darkest marks on a person's record were the cleanest parts of who they were. He sat down in the chair and didn't say anything else. That was the only time Sal Marchetti ever objected. That afternoon, Elias called Maeve in. He told her his restaurants and trucking companies had storage rooms full of accounting records left behind by previous managers. 3 different systems, none of them complete. He said he needed someone to rebuild them properly. Maeve stood there for a long time before saying she wouldn't accept something given out of pity. She said she had been helpless long enough, and if he was bringing her in just to give her a place to sit so he could feel better about himself, she would leave. She said she needed to work. Elias said, "That is exactly the job." Then she asked him directly who he was. He answered honestly, without decorating the truth, without hiding parts of it, and when he finished, he simply stood there and waited. Maeve listened to everything, her expression unchanged, and then she asked one single question. She asked if he would ever make her do something against her conscience. Elias said, "Never." She looked at him for another moment, then nodded and said, "Then I accept." In the 2nd week, Elias told her to come with him down to the docks, saying the trucking company's records were kept there, and she needed to see firsthand the place where she would have to rebuild everything. Maeve brought her notebook and sat quietly the entire drive. The office at the docks was small, with fogged glass windows, and when they arrived, there was already a man sitting inside, his hands resting on the desk, his back stiff and straight. Elias told her to wait outside in the hallway. She waited. The door closed but didn't lock, and she heard everything. She heard Elias pull out a chair and sit down. He didn't yell. He didn't raise his voice. He asked about the man's wife, asked what grade his oldest child was in that year, asked if the younger one was feeling better after being sick, and he asked with a voice that genuinely wanted to know, with the voice of a decent neighbor. The man answered every question, his voice becoming thinner with each response. Then, Elias said he had reviewed the payroll records from the last 3 months. He said there were dozens of dock workers at this port, and there was a difference between what people signed for and what they actually brought home. He said the difference wasn't large. He said for a dock worker with 3 children, it was large. Then Maeve heard papers slide across the desk. Elias said he had 10 minutes to write down the real number himself. He said, "After 10 minutes, I will write it, and the number I write won't be good for you." After that came silence, a silence so long that Maeve could hear the ships outside the harbor, and even her own breathing. She stood there, holding her notebook, and realized her hands were cold. There was no shouting, no breaking glass, no one touched anyone. Yet during those 10 minutes, she was more afraid than she had ever been during the nights she slept in her car with the doors locked. When the door opened, the man walked past her, eyes lowered toward the floor, and there wasn't a single mark on him. He had simply lost everything. 3 days later, Maeve happened to hear that the man had gone looking for work at 2 other docks, then 3, then all across the state. And everywhere people accepted his application politely and never called back. No one banned him. No one threatened him. His name simply no longer carried any value on any shoreline in that state. On the way home, Elias received a phone call. Maeve sat beside him and listened as he spoke to someone on the other end, and his voice at that moment was flat as ice, never rising even half a note, with not a single unnecessary word. He said 3 sentences and hung up. Then he turned toward her, and that voice disappeared completely, replaced by something entirely different, almost uncertain, and he asked if she had eaten yet. Maeve looked at him for a long time. Then she asked if he was tired. Elias asked, "Tired from what?" She said tired from having to be 2 different people at the same time. Elias didn't answer immediately. He looked out the window, watching the rows of warehouses pass by, and finally he said yes. Then he added, quieter, that no one had asked him that question in 11 years. That afternoon they stopped by the main restaurant to collect the remaining boxes of old documents stored in the basement. Gus Palermo came out to greet them, wiping his hands on his apron, apologizing 3 times within a minute, once for the dusty storage room, once because the hallway light hadn't been replaced yet, and once for something he said, and then immediately forgot the reason for. He was in his 40s, with thinning hair and a soft build, the kind of man who made people feel comfortable the moment they met him. Gus carried 2 boxes to the car for her, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a set of keys, removed one, and handed it to her. He said it was the key to the back parking gate, that she should keep it, because parking on the street at night wasn't convenient, and the back entrance was quiet, with almost no one passing through. Maeve thanked him, put the key into her coat pocket, and didn't think about it for another second. That night, she sat in her room, opened her notebook, and the first thing she wrote wasn't a number. She wrote 1 short sentence for herself to read, that this man had never frightened her until today. Then she crossed it out. Then she wrote it again. Then she closed the notebook, turned off the light, and lay there staring at the ceiling for a long time before she finally fell asleep. That Thursday, Maeve asked for half a day off, and Elias asked where she was going. She said she was going to visit her sister. He said he would drive her. She said there was no need. He was already holding the car keys. The rehabilitation center was on the edge of the city, with long hallways and glass doors. And when the 2 of them walked in, someone at the end of the hallway shouted that Maeve Sullivan was 15 minutes late and that she was keeping track. Poppy Sullivan was 19 years old, her hair tied high, holding onto the parallel bars and moving toward them step by step, her face red from the effort but her mouth unable to stop talking. She said, "Where have you been, Maeve? Why are you wearing new clothes like that? Did you win the lottery? Are you going to confess, or do I have to investigate?" Then she looked over at Elias, narrowed her eyes, then looked back at her sister, and said, just 1 word. That was all. But it made Maeve's face turn red all the way to her ears. Poppy walked the entire length of the bars, then let go, stood straight, raised both hands into the air like an athlete who had just crossed the finish line, and announced that she had broken her personal record today, that the therapist had to admit it, and that next week she planned to walk all the way to the vending machine at the end of the hallway, so she wouldn't have to ask anyone to buy things for her anymore, because everyone kept choosing the wrong flavors. Elias said she was walking very well. Poppy said, "Thank you, sir. You're the first person who complimented me without adding 'keep trying' afterward. I've heard that phrase so many times I want to print it on a shirt." While the 2 sisters talked, Elias stepped out into the hallway. Maeve looked after him and saw him standing beside the window, phone pressed to his ear, talking for about 10 minutes. She couldn't hear anything. But when the two of them reached the parking lot, the receptionist called after them and said, "Miss Sullivan, the accounting department just informed us that your sister's therapy sessions will remain unchanged, and the remaining balance will be divided into monthly payments without any additional charges." Maeve stopped in the middle of the parking lot. She turned toward Elias and asked what he had done. He said he didn't pay anything. He said he only called the person in charge and talked. Maeve said that was even worse. Elias asked how that was worse. She stood there, gripping the strap of her bag, and when she spoke, her voice trembled. Not because she was sad, but because it was something far more bitter. She said, "You just talked to them with the kind of voice I've never dared to use my entire life." She said she had called that place countless times, begged, explained, read that extension request form over and over until she had memorized every word, and every time they had been very polite, and every time the answer had been no. She said he made one call, 10 minutes, and everything changed. She said she wasn't angry at him. She was angry at a world where one person's voice could be worth more than another person's circumstances. Elias didn't argue. He said she was right. He said that was one of the things he couldn't fix. They went back inside so Maeve could say goodbye to her sister before leaving, and Poppy was sitting on the resting chair, both hands rubbing her knees, and when she saw her sister, she stopped smiling. She said, "Sit down here first." Maeve sat down. Poppy said, "Do you remember that video call you made with me a few weeks ago? The one where you said you were at home and the light was a little dark because the bulb was broken?" Maeve said she remembered. Poppy said she saw the steering wheel. She said she saw the reflection of the steering wheel in her sister's glasses. Very faint, but she saw it. She said she didn't ask because she knew if she asked, her sister would deny it, and then her sister would cry after hanging up, and what would that solve? Maeve opened her mouth to speak. Poppy didn't let her. She took her sister's hand and said, "Stop." She said whether she could walk again or not was her own journey, not Maeve's burden. She said, "Don't die because of me." She said if Maeve collapsed, then what was she even sitting here training for? Then, exactly like herself, she immediately switched to another subject and said next week Maeve had to bring her the sandwich from the corner shop, the one Maeve always criticized, because she liked the shop Maeve hated. Maeve laughed while tears were still running down her face. Elias stood at the doorway without stepping inside, and he watched the two sisters, and a very strange question appeared in his mind, asking how long it had been since he had seen two people argue because they loved each other. The work of rebuilding the books moved slowly, and Maeve liked it that way. She worked in the room at the end of the first floor, with the door left open, and every day she pulled up another box of records, sorting them by year, by supplier, by payment method. The previous management had kept records in 3 different ways, layered on top of each other, and none of them had ever been completed properly. She spent nearly 2 weeks just building the framework. Then the framework existed, and once it existed, the things that didn't fit began to reveal themselves on their own. The name appeared on an ordinary afternoon, a seafood supplier. Every month there was a payment to them, steady, without missing a single month, continuing for years. Maeve searched for delivery receipts to compare, just as she did with every other supplier. There were none. She searched through the second box. Nothing. She went down to the storage room, brought up 2 more boxes, sat there until evening, opened every file, and still found nothing. Not a single delivery receipt. Not a single inspection report. Not one damaged goods complaint. And in the seafood business, there should have been at least 1 complaint every month. She checked with the kitchen. The head chef of the main restaurant told her that they had always bought seafood from 2 familiar vendors at the fish market, and he gave her the names of those 2 suppliers, and neither of them was the name in the records. He said he had never heard of that other company. Maeve returned to her desk and sat there for a long time. What sent a chill through her was not the amount of money. The amount was small enough that if someone glanced over the monthly expenses, it would slide past like an electricity bill. It was also split apart, never the same amount from month to month, sometimes slightly higher, sometimes slightly lower, exactly the kind of pattern someone experienced would create, so that no single number repeated enough to form a shape. She had seen that pattern once before in her life, in the file someone had handed her, and told her to adjust a few things. Maeve didn't tell anyone. She took a blank sheet of paper, copied down the supplier's name and the timeline, folded it into quarters, tucked it inside her notebook, and closed it. She told herself it could be because the previous management had been careless. She told herself the delivery receipts might be stored somewhere else. She didn't believe a single word of what she was telling herself. That night she stayed late, and when she carried the notebook down the hallway toward her room, she heard voices around the corner ahead. She stopped, not because she wanted to listen. It was just that taking another step would mean walking directly past someone while they were having a private conversation, and she had lived long enough in a vulnerable position to know that standing still was always safer. She recognized Sal's voice. The other voice belonged to a woman, and Maeve had only met her once, at dinner the week before, when the woman had shaken her hand gently, smiled beautifully, and asked her nothing. Camille Ashford told Sal that she was just a normal person. She said it not with bitterness, not with anger, explaining something obvious. She said normal people don't die because of enemies. She said normal people die because they stand too close to him. Then she continued, her voice lowering, saying that when that happened, he would bury her, and then he would blame himself for the rest of his life, and she would be the one forced to sit there and watch it happen. There was a silence. Then Sal asked her again. He asked whether she was saving him or saving her own position. Camille didn't answer immediately, and when she finally did, Maeve couldn't hear clearly anymore because her ears had started ringing. She stood against the wall in the darkness of the hallway, the notebook pressed against her chest, and she didn't feel angry. That was the frightening part. She wasn't angry because the first half of that woman's words was true. It was true enough that Maeve had told herself the same thing many times, only with different words. During nights when she lay awake staring at the ceiling, she thought about the man sitting in the small room at the harbor, about the blank sheet of paper, about those 10 minutes of silence. She thought about the supplier's name folded into quarters inside the notebook in her hand. Then she turned around, walked back toward the rear staircase, and returned to her room by another route, so that no one would ever know she had been standing there. For the next few days, Maeve couldn't sleep. Every night she lay there thinking about the name folded into quarters inside her notebook, then thinking about the words that woman had said in the hallway, and then she would come back to the name again. One night she gave up, went downstairs, stepped outside through the front door to get some air, and sat down on the top of the 3 stone steps. She sat there because it was the closest place to sit. She didn't know. No one had told her. Rosa hadn't said anything. Sal hadn't said anything. And Elias certainly hadn't. She sat with her knees drawn up, looking out at the quiet street of North End, and she had been there for about 10 minutes when she heard the door open behind her. Elias stood there. He didn't step outside. He stood in the doorway and looked at her, looked at the place where she was sitting, and there was something on his face that Maeve couldn't read. She immediately understood that she had done something wrong. She stood up quickly and started apologizing. Elias told her to sit down. Then he stepped outside, and he sat beside her, on those same stone steps, for the first time in 11 years. It took him a moment before he actually settled down, like someone testing the temperature of cold water before stepping in. The two of them sat in silence for a long time. Then he told her. He told it briefly, without unnecessary details, his voice steady like he was reading from an old report. He said when he was 22 years old, he was still in school, and he had planned to pursue a completely different career, one that sounded almost funny to mention now. He said the night everything changed. He wasn't home. The next morning, someone called him back, and there were 7 men sitting in the living room waiting for him, all of them at least 20 years older than him, and not one of those 7 men asked if he wanted the role. He said they only asked him if he could do it. He said he answered yes, because at that moment there was no other answer that existed in that room. He said he thought he would only hold the position for a few years and then hand it over to someone else. Then a few years became 11 years. Maeve asked if he had ever tried to leave. Elias didn't answer immediately. He looked down at his hands. Then he said there were 400 people whose lives depended on the kitchens and trucks he controlled. He said they raised their children with those wages. They paid their rent with those wages. He said if he walked away, who would they follow? Maeve didn't answer. She only thought, quickly and clearly, that this man and she were alike in a way no one else could see, that both of them were bound by a piece of paper they had signed when they no longer had any other choice. She turned to look at him. He was looking at her too. Neither of them said anything else. The kiss happened slowly, hesitantly, and both of them stopped halfway as if waiting for the other person to pull away, and neither of them did. When they separated, Maeve lowered her head and laughed softly, while Elias released a long breath, like a person who had finally put down something he had carried for far too long. Then there was the sound of an engine at the end of the street. A car approached, moving very slowly, slower than a normal vehicle passing someone else's house in the middle of the night. It passed the gate, and it didn't stop completely, but it slowed for exactly 1 moment in front of the entrance, then continued on. Elias didn't turn around. He didn't look after it. He only said quietly, his voice still calm, "Go inside." Maeve asked what was wrong. He said nothing was wrong. Then he said it again, and this time his voice left no room for questions. but go inside. She stood up, walked in, and at the doorway she looked back once. Elias was still sitting there on the stone steps, back straight, face turned toward the street, and he remained there long after the sound of the car had disappeared at the end of the road. That night Maeve lay in bed thinking, and the thing she thought about was not the kiss. She thought about the fact that this was the second time since she arrived at this house that a strange car had slowed down in front of that gate. The first time was on her very first night, when she had still been sitting on those steps with the red delivery bag in her hands, and she had thought it was only a car passing by. The call came in close to 10 o'clock at night. 2 cargo containers belonging to the transportation company had been held at the South Yard, with no paperwork explaining why, no one willing to take responsibility, and the person working the yard saying the computer system was having problems in the voice of someone who had already been instructed to say exactly that. Elias stood up, put on his coat, and Maeve said she was going with him, because the receiving records for those 2 containers were in the files she was rebuilding. He looked at her for a moment, then nodded, and he said only one thing. "You stay in the car." When they arrived, the entire row of floodlights along the port had gone dark. Not partially, completely. The wide yard was lit only by the faint glow coming from ships anchored in the distance, and the headlights of 2 vehicles parked diagonally in the middle. Elias got out. Sal followed half a step behind him. From the darkness on the other side, a man walked out, somewhere past 50, moving casually like he was strolling through his own backyard, and he greeted Elias by his first name, warmly, almost affectionately, Warren Kessler. Maeve sat inside the car, the window lowered just a small crack, and she heard every word. Kessler said the yard had been having electrical problems lately. He said he didn't understand why. He said, "You know how it is, old equipment. The city moves slowly. People keep making promises." Elias said he wanted his 2 containers. Kessler asked where the paperwork was. Elias said the paperwork was in the car, and if Mr. Kessler wanted to see it, he was welcome to come take a look. Kessler laughed. He said Elias was still the same. He said his father used to talk with paperwork like that too. Then he added another sentence, casually, the way older men sometimes speak when they want to show they have lived longer than someone else, saying his father also once thought he had control over this port. Elias didn't react. Sal didn't react either. The sentence fell onto the concrete and stayed there, among the other empty boasts of a man who had just cut power to an entire port yard simply to prove that he could. Elias said he would say this only once. He said those 2 containers would leave the yard before midnight, or tomorrow morning every shipper sending goods through this place would receive a call from him, and he wouldn't say anything cruel. He would simply tell the exact story of what happened tonight, exactly as it happened. He told Mr. Kessler to calculate how long it would take before people moved their shipments to another port. He said it all without raising his voice even once, from beginning to end, and that was what made the entire dark yard fall silent. Kessler stared at him for a long moment, then shrugged and said, "Fine. Looks like the computer just came back online." And he walked away. 10 minutes later, the floodlights turned on one section at a time, and the 2 containers were pulled out toward the gate. Elias got back into the car, closed the door, and sat there silently. Maeve sat beside him, and she saw it. His hand resting on his thigh was shaking. Not much, just the slightest tremor at the tips of his fingers, the kind of thing only someone sitting close enough and watching long enough would notice. He didn't hide it, and he didn't say anything about it. She didn't either. The car had gone a little distance when Maeve spoke, and she talked about something completely different. She said she had realized something while sitting in the car. She said she couldn't go back to delivery work anymore. Elias asked why, saying he had never forbidden her from doing it. She said it wasn't because he forbade her. She said it was because people had seen her face now. She said before, she had been invisible. She said no one remembered the face of a delivery worker. People opened the door, took the bag, closed the door, and in those 3 seconds she didn't exist, and that not existing was the only thing that had protected her for the past 2 years. She said now she had lost that. Elias didn't deny it. He didn't tell her she was overthinking. He didn't say he would take care of everything. He only said, "I know." Then they stayed silent for the rest of the drive home, and outside the windows, the city passed by with rows of lights glowing from homes where no one had to cut the power just to frighten someone. At the end of the month, Elias told her there was one more thing to finish. The tax accountants needed a year-end summary, and that report had to list everything the family owned, not just the restaurants and the trucks, but everything, every single item, including things purchased years ago and left untouched because no one had bothered with them. Maeve accepted the task, And she did it the same way she always did. Slowly, steadily, one line at a time. The list was long. Some names sounded like construction companies. Some were only a few initials. Some names she had to look up just to understand what they were. She worked until well past the middle of the afternoon, when she reached a line hidden in the middle of the table, not bolded, without any notes, grouped together with other financial investments. Maeve read the name, and her hand stopped above the keyboard. She knew that name. She knew it more clearly than she knew the name of her own street. It was the name printed in the upper left corner of the window envelopes that had followed her for 3 years. The envelopes she received at her old address, then at temporary addresses, then at a mailbox inside a laundromat where she paid monthly, just so she would still have somewhere to receive mail. It was the name at the end of every phone call at 7 in the morning and 8 at night. It was the name she had read so many times that if someone misspelled even one letter, she would recognize it immediately. She sat there for a very long time. Then she checked again. She searched the business identification number, compared it with the line on an old envelope she still kept inside her backpack, and it matched. She checked a second time by tracing the purchase year backward, and it matched. She checked a third time, the slowest and most careful time, because she needed something to be wrong. She needed it desperately, and there was nothing wrong. 4 years earlier, the Ferraro family had purchased an entire portfolio of bad medical debt for almost nothing. Inside that portfolio was the document she had signed with her mother in that hospital room. She stood up, printed the page, and walked straight to Elias's office. She didn't knock. She placed the paper on his desk, pointed to the line, and asked him what it was. Elias looked down. He stared at it for a long time. Then he sat up straight, and on his face was something Maeve had never seen on this man before. Not even in the pitch dark of the courtyard the night before. He called Sal in. Sal entered, looked at the paper, and his face turned gray within 2 seconds. Sal was the one who spoke. He said 4 years earlier the cash flow had been unstable. They needed a clean channel, and purchasing bad debt had been the cleanest channel of all, because the cost of entry was low, and the returns were legitimate collections, with invoices, statements, and everything an auditor wanted to see. He said it had been his recommendation. He said he had brought the files forward and Elias had signed. Maeve turned to Elias and asked if he had read them. Elias did not lie. He said no. She asked how long he had taken before signing. He was silent. Sal answered for him, his voice very quiet, saying that Elias had signed in less than a minute, along with more than a dozen other files that morning. Maeve nodded. She didn't yell. She didn't cry. She stood there with both hands hanging at her sides, and her voice was calmer than it had been when she sat at that long dining table and told the story of her life. She said she had paid for 3 years. She said every month she paid. Some months she skipped meals to pay. Some months she sold something to pay, and she had never been late once. She said that amount of money, to him, was only a line used to make another financial structure cleaner. She said to her, "It was 3 years of being afraid to get sick." Elias opened his mouth. Only one sentence came out, and it wasn't an explanation. He said, "You're right." Maeve looked at him for another moment. Then she turned away. She went back to her room, packed her things into the backpack that had followed her for 2 years, and she packed carefully, slowly, the way someone packs when they are used to leaving places they thought they had finally been allowed to stay. She left the work notebook on the desk, opened to the final page where she had written her notes. She left through the side door. Rosa stood at the end of the hallway, still holding a cleaning cloth, and she didn't dare call out. Outside the gate, Maeve's car started on the first turn of the key, and Elias Ferraro remained sitting in his office, staring at the paper with that name on it, and he didn't chase after her, because for the first time in 11 years, he knew with absolute certainty that he had no right to. Elias sat in his office until almost dawn before he made the call. He called the person in charge of the debt collection company, the company he had not even remembered owning until the day before, and he woke the man at 4 in the morning, demanding only one thing: the complete file on Maeve Sullivan, the full version, nothing removed, nothing shortened, sent to him before sunrise. He said he wanted it erased. The man asked what he meant by erased. Elias said, "In the sense that it disappears from every system you have." The file arrived close to 6. It was thicker than he expected, not because the debt itself was complicated, but because behind every debt like this, they kept something else as well, something called a contact log. Every phone call was one line. Every letter was one line. Every time someone called and no one answered was also one line. Elias turned from the first page. He read slowly. He read the dates, the times of the calls, the abbreviated notes written by people who had worked in that field so long they no longer bothered to write full words. He reached several dozen pages in and stopped. There was a line dated 9 weeks earlier. It was short. It was typed in the same administrative tone as every other line in the file. It said the subject reported loss of housing. Then, on the very same line, came the recommended action: maintain the current collection schedule. Elias did not move. He sat there in the room where the morning light was slowly crawling across the surface of the desk, his hand still resting on the paper, his eyes fixed on that line. He remained like that for a very long time. Then he reached out and pressed the call button. Sal entered, his shirt still partly unbuttoned, his hair messy, the face of a man who had not slept all night either. Elias did not ask him to sit. He turned the paper around, pushed it toward Sal, and pointed to the line with one finger. Sal leaned down and read. He read everything. Then he stood upright and said nothing. Elias asked him one question. He asked how many records in the entire portfolio contained notes like this. Sal didn't answer. Elias asked again, every word exactly the same. Not louder, not faster. Sal still didn't answer. He stood there with his hands hanging at his sides, looking out the window instead of looking at Elias. Elias said, count them. He said he wanted the exact number. He said he didn't need it today. He didn't need it this week. He needed it right. Every single file. And he would sit there and read them all. Sal opened his mouth. No sound came out. That man had been in this house since before Elias could walk. He had sat in the living room with 6 other men on the morning they called the 22-year-old boy home and asked him if he could do it. He had stood beside him for 11 years, stopped him, advised him, worried for him, and convinced himself that he was the one keeping Elias from falling, and that recommendation had been his. Sal Marchetti's shoulders collapsed. He raised a hand to cover his mouth, turned away, and cried, silently, the way a man in his 50s cried when he had never allowed anyone to see him cry before. He cried for about a minute. Then he wiped his face with the back of his hand, took a breath, and said exactly 3 words. I'll count. Elias did not stand. He did not put a hand on Sal's shoulder. He did not say it was okay. He only nodded once, then lowered his head, turned to the next page of the file, and continued reading, from the beginning, every single line, until there was nothing left. Maeve came back the following afternoon, not because anyone called her, but because her work notebook was still on the desk, and inside it was the folded piece of paper about the seafood supplier, and she couldn't leave this city while letting someone else read it. She entered through the side door, took the notebook, and when she reached the back parking area, there were already 3 men standing there. Her car had all 4 doors wide open. On the hood was a prepaid phone, a cheap one, black plastic casing, placed neatly there like someone had just set it down. The man standing closest said they found it under the driver's seat. Inside the phone were pictures of several pages from the transportation company's records, taken at an angle, poorly lit, the kind of pictures someone takes quickly with one hand. And there was a number that had been called repeatedly, a number everyone in that house knew, belonged to someone on Kessler's side. Half an hour later, the large dining room had more than a dozen people sitting inside. No one had touched that long table since the night Maeve arrived, and now every seat was filled. Maeve stood at the end of the room, her backpack still on her shoulder, and no one invited her to sit. They spoke. They said she had only been there a few months. They said she had the keys to the records room. They said the irregular numbers at the port had started leaking out around the same time she began rebuilding the books. They said she had debt, and people with debt could be bought. Someone said that while looking directly into her eyes. Elias sat at the other end of the table and did not interrupt a single person. He let them finish. Then he turned to Sal and asked what he thought. The entire room waited, because everyone sitting there knew who Sal Marchetti was. Knew he had opposed Elias from the very first night, and they were all waiting for him to say the words they wanted to hear. Sal didn't speak. He sat upright, both hands resting on the table, looking down at those hands. Someone called his name. He still said nothing. The silence lasted long enough to become an answer, and it was the only answer that man could give, because 2 nights earlier, he had seen his own signature at the bottom of a proposal, and from that moment on, he had lost the right to point a finger at anyone in that room. Someone asked him then how he thought the other side had managed to buy someone inside the house. Sal looked up, and he answered only that question. He said Kessler had never needed to hit anyone. He said all he needed to do was find what a person was afraid of losing, then pay for it. When he finished, he lowered his eyes again. Elias stood up. He walked around the table, came to stand in front of Maeve, and the entire room watched. He did not ask her about the phone. He did not ask whether anyone had contacted her. He asked her one thing, and he asked it loudly enough for everyone in that room to hear. He asked if she had done it. Maeve looked directly into his eyes. She said no. Elias nodded and said, "Then I believe you." Chairs shifted. Someone said, "Believe her based on what?" Elias turned back toward the table and said she had held the keys to the records room for months and had not taken a single dollar from him, while he himself had taken everything she had. He said, "Who do you want me to suspect first?" No one answered. Elias said she had 48 hours. He said she would stay in this house, she would not leave the gate, she would work in the records room, and Rosa would stay with her the entire time. He said he was not asking anyone's permission about it. Then he added one more thing, turning back toward the table, saying that if after 48 hours she could not produce anything, then he himself would sit there and answer every question they had. Maeve looked at him. She did not thank him. She simply took off her backpack, placed it on a chair, then walked straight toward the records room, and Rosa quietly followed behind her, still holding the cleaning cloth in her hand. Maeve didn't start with the phone. She started with the folded piece of paper in her notebook, the seafood supplier that had been paid for years without a single delivery receipt to prove anything had ever arrived. She told Rosa to sit wherever she wanted, and Rosa pulled a chair into the corner of the room, sat down, and stayed there the entire time. The first thing Maeve did was pull out the delivery logs from that company, the only thing they had ever sent, along with each payment cycle, several printed pages listing dates, times, license plates, and pickup locations. There were no real delivery receipts, but there were fake delivery logs, and whoever created a fake record always had to write something down. She read everything. She built a chart: date, time, license plate, location. She worked continuously through the night, and on the second night of the 48-hour deadline, one line made her sit up straight: a license plate, a timestamp. She had seen that license plate somewhere before. Maeve searched through her backpack. Inside, among the pile of documents, was a small memory drive. She had developed that habit during her first year doing deliveries, after a customer once called the company and claimed she had delivered an incomplete order, and she had been docked pay without anyone asking her a single question. From that day on, whenever there was a complaint, she would save a separate copy of the dash camera footage from her route, because she had learned that when no one believed her, she had to keep her own evidence. On the first night she came to this house, there had been a complaint like that too, from a customer at the building before, claiming she had missed part of an order, and the next morning she had sat in her car, exported the footage from that entire shift, and then forgotten about it among everything else that happened afterward. She plugged the memory drive into the computer. The footage was dark, rain pouring across the windshield, and it didn't capture anyone's face, didn't show anyone stepping out, didn't record anyone saying anything. It only showed a small dark truck parked several houses away from the Ferraro gate, its rear lights still on, and a corner of the license plate clearly visible for about 2 seconds when her headlights swept across it. Maeve froze the frame. She compared it with her chart. It matched. Then she opened the seafood company's delivery log and traced it back to that exact date, that exact time frame. The log claimed that the truck with that license plate, on that exact night, at that exact hour, was receiving a shipment at a yard dozens of miles south of Boston. A vehicle couldn't be in 2 places at once. One of the records was fake, and the fake one wasn't the footage recorded by a delivery driver's dash camera. Maeve leaned back in her chair and let out a slow breath. Then she kept going. She asked herself why no one had discovered it for years, because a steady expense like that should have been touched by every audit. She pulled out the internal audit reports, arranged them chronologically, and looked at the place nobody bothered to examine, the signature in the lower right corner. The person who signed was the former chief accountant of the Ferraro family, an elderly man who had retired and moved out of state more than a year earlier. Maeve placed the pages side by side under the desk lamp. In the early reports, the signature had a small hook at the end of the final letter, a stroke that rose and curved back around. In the last 9 reports, that hook disappeared. The pen pressure was heavier, more controlled, and controlled in a way that was wrong, because an elderly man's handwriting was never that perfectly consistent. The old accountant hadn't taken anyone's money. He had simply retired, and someone had signed in his place. The next morning, with less than 3 hours remaining in the 48-hour deadline, Maeve carried the file into Elias's office. She had organized it exactly the way an accountant organized everything, with a table of contents, numbered pages, and a comparison sheet so anyone holding it could understand without needing her explanation. She placed it on the desk. Elias reached for it. Maeve kept her hand on the cover and said she wasn't giving it to him. He looked up. She said she would give it to someone he couldn't buy. She said she had looked into it, and there was a federal law office that accepted this kind of evidence. And if he intended to handle this the way people in North End handled things, she respectfully wouldn't be part of it. Elias looked at her for a long time. Then he pulled his hand back, nodded, and said okay. He asked her only one question before she walked out. He asked if she regretted it, coming back, staying another 2 days. Maeve stopped at the door. She said not for a single second. That afternoon, the large dining room was full of people again, and this time Maeve was invited to sit. But she stood. She said nothing about herself. She didn't mention the phone. She opened the file and read, item by item, her voice steady like she was reading an official report, and she handed each page to the person closest to her so it could be passed around the table. She began with the supplier that had no delivery receipts, then the license plate comparison chart, then the frozen frame from the footage, the 2 seconds when the headlights swept across it, then the 9 audit periods with the missing hook in the signature. When she finished reading, she closed the file and said money had been leaving this house for years, and it had been flowing through the hands of someone in this room. The entire table went silent. Camille Ashford sat on the other side, her hands resting on the wood, and she didn't turn pale at all. She simply closed her eyes for one long moment, like someone who had finally put down something she had been carrying for too long. Then she said, I signed it. She said no one needed to read another page. The signatures on the last 9 audits were hers. Chairs shifted around the table. Elias raised his hand, and the room settled again. He asked why. Camille said her father owed Warren Kessler. She said the debt existed before she ever knew about it, and by the time she found out, it was already too late to pay it back with money. She said Kessler never threatened her, not even once. He simply came, sat down, spoke very politely, said he understood, said everyone had family problems, said he would help her, and that when the time came, she could help him with one small thing. Camille said the first small thing was a signature, then the second small thing, then she stopped counting. Elias asked who leaked the information. He asked who told Kessler someone was digging into this. Camille said, it wasn't me. She said she signed the papers, but she never spoke with his people. She said that person was inside this house. At the end of the room, near the door leading to the kitchen, Gus Palermo stood up. No one called his name. He stood on his own, still wearing the apron tied around his waist, both hands gripping the back of the chair, and he said, it was me. Everyone turned. Elias said nothing. Gus said he was the only one who had the key to the back parking lot. He said he was the one who placed the phone there. He said he had put it on the seat and then sat in the kitchen the entire evening, and he had vomited afterward. Then he explained why, and he spoke very slowly, like he had to pull each word out from somewhere deep inside his chest. He said his wife was sick. She had been sick for a long time. He said that illness didn't kill a person quickly. It just kept taking pieces away, and every month there was another bill. He said he had asked everyone he could ask for help, sold his car, sold the small house in the suburbs that he and his wife had spent their whole lives saving for, and it still wasn't enough. He said he couldn't ask the boss, because if he asked, Elias would help him, and he couldn't bear the thought of asking money from the person he owed his loyalty to. He said then someone came to him in the parking lot, someone he had never met before, and that person didn't threaten him, didn't yell, only said, we know things are difficult at home, and starting next month, you won't have to worry about that bill anymore. Gus said for 2 years he hadn't paid a single dollar. He said for 2 years he also hadn't slept through a single night peacefully. Maeve looked at him and couldn't say anything, because she realized they had bought him with the exact thing that had crushed her. Then Gus said his final words, and he said them to Maeve, not Elias. He said, do you remember that delivery order that night? He said the address was entered by him. He said that evening he had stayed awake all night because the hospital had called. He had been sitting in front of the computer with his mind somewhere else, and he had typed the wrong house number, entering Elias's house instead of the restaurant, 2 addresses separated by only 1 number. He said he had regretted that mistake for months, until today, when he realized that very mistake was what had brought her to that doorstep. He sat down and said nothing else. Camille stood up and asked to leave, and before she went, she stopped beside Maeve. She said, I stood beside him for 6 years, and never dared to say a word. She said, you slept outside his house for 1 night. Then she said, the difference was never about time. It was about the fact that you never needed him to owe you anything. The door closed behind Camille, and no one in the dining room said a word. Gus was still sitting at the end of the table, both hands resting on his lap, his eyes lowered. Someone cleared his throat. Someone turned the glass in his hand without taking a drink. Everyone was waiting, because in this world, after an afternoon like this, there was always a next part. And the next part was usually the part no one wanted to tell. Elias stood up. He didn't walk toward Gus. He walked to the head of the table, the place where for 11 years he had always stood whenever he had to say something no one was allowed to question afterward, and he stood there with both hands pressed against the wood. He said Camille's matter and Gus's matter would be handled separately, according to the law, and he would speak about it later. Then he said there was something else he needed to say right now, in front of everyone, so that starting tomorrow no one would have to guess anymore. He turned toward Maeve. She was still standing at the end of the room, holding the file against her chest, and she had remained in that same position for almost an hour. Elias said this woman was not a guest in this house. He said she was not an employee either. He said for months they had looked at her as something he had simply picked up and brought home, and he had allowed them to see her that way because he thought eventually they would understand on their own. He said he was wrong. He said he should have said this a long time ago. Then he said the words, and he said them very normally, without raising his voice, without emphasizing a single one. He said, "Anyone who touches her touches me." No one moved. Elias continued, and this was the part that made the entire room fall so silent that the clock in the hallway could be heard. He said he knew there were people in this room who disagreed. He said he knew some had been calculating this for weeks. Some had spoken together after hours, and he didn't blame them. He said because of that, he would make things simple. He said anyone who disagreed should stand up right now. Right now, in this room, in front of everyone. He said whoever stood up, he would hand over everything. The restaurants, the trucks, the port operations, all of it. Within the week, with no arguments, no aftermath, no retaliation. He said he would sign the papers, leave, and never come back. Then he straightened and waited. No one stood. Someone looked down at the table. Someone glanced at the person beside him and then looked away. The clock in the hallway struck once, and everyone startled at the sound. Elias remained standing. He didn't rush them. He let the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable, until every person in that room was forced to answer the question for themselves and not for him. Then, in the middle of the table, Sal Marchetti pushed his chair back slightly, sat up straighter, and nodded. Just once. The man who had opposed Elias from the very first rainy night in March, the man who had stood beneath the wooden sign in the kitchen and said the kindest thing to do was give her money and have a car take her away, the man who had cried days earlier in the office because of a line he didn't write but had signed, that man was the first one to nod. After him came another, then two more, then the entire table. There was no applause. No one said anything. It was only the nods passing one by one around the long table, like something moving through each person and leaving its mark behind. Elias didn't thank anyone. He only said the meeting was over. Then he walked around the table toward Maeve. She was still holding the file, and when he reached her, she only then realized how exhausted her arms had become. She said quietly, softly enough that only he could hear, "You just put everything on the table." Elias said, "I know." She asked, "What if someone had stood up?" He said, "Then I would have left." She asked, "And the 400 people?" Elias looked at her, and for the first time that afternoon, something deeply tired appeared in his eyes. He said, "I've asked myself that question for 11 years. Then he added, "Today was the first time I realized there was another question worth asking." The next morning, Rosa Bianchi walked into the office and stood in the middle of the room instead of standing by the door like she always did. She held a yellowed envelope, its edges worn from time, and she placed it on the desk in front of Elias. She said his grandmother had given it to her before she passed away. She said the old woman had told her to keep it, and she had given one very specific instruction, to give it to the boy on the day he opened the front door again. Elias looked up. Rosa said she had kept it for 11 years. She said the night he stepped onto those front steps, she had almost given it to him immediately, but then she stopped because she was afraid that after reading it, he would send the girl away, and at that moment she wanted the girl to stay. She said now she was giving it to him. Then she walked out and closed the door behind her. The letter was short. His grandmother's handwriting was large and slanted. The ink faded with age, and she wrote in the kind of English a person learns when they are already older, with many mistakes, but not a single unnecessary word. She wrote that she knew after his father died, he would close that door. She wrote that she didn't blame him. She wrote that she only wanted him to know why the wooden sign in the kitchen existed, because she had never told anyone the reason behind it. Then she told the story. She wrote that when she was 19, she had just arrived in this country, with nothing. And one winter night she stood in front of a house on the other side of the city, knocked on the door, and asked if she could sit in the hallway until morning. She wrote that there were lights on inside. She wrote that someone came and looked at her through the glass, watched her for a moment, then walked away, and the hallway light went out. She wrote that she walked until morning that night, because if she sat down, she knew she would never get back up. She wrote that later she had a home, a kitchen, children, grandchildren, and she hung that sign on the wall during the very first week she lived there. The final sentence she wrote was shorter than all the others. She wrote that if someone had opened that door that night, her entire life would have been different, and her child's entire life would have been different too. She wrote that she never wanted her house to become that closed door. Elias finished reading and sat there for a long time, still holding the paper in his hand, without folding it. The door opened. Maeve walked in, holding a thin sheet of paper, and she said she was sorry for not knocking. Then she said, "Look at this." She said she had been sorting through the oldest boxes of documents in the storage room, the ones from the management before the previous management, and she had almost thrown this away because she thought it was filed by mistake. It was a cold storage maintenance invoice. The date on the signature was clear. Elias looked at the date, and he didn't need anyone to tell him what day it was. It was the day his father died. Maeve said the address on the invoice wasn't a Ferraro property. She said she had traced the entire family property records from previous generations to the present, and the family had never owned a cold storage facility at that address. She said the payment wasn't made by their company either. It had been paid by another party, and yet the invoice had ended up inside the Ferraro records, as if someone had taken it, hidden it among their documents, and then forgotten about it. She said she didn't know what it proved. She said, according to her profession, it proved only one thing, that on that night, someone inside this house knew where the old man would be, and that person had told someone outside. Elias didn't answer. He placed his grandmother's letter on the desk, placed the invoice beside it, and looked at the two pieces of paper lying side by side on the wood. Then something in his mind moved backward, back to that dark courtyard that night, back to the man who walked out as casually as if he were strolling through his own backyard, back to the sentence that everyone had dismissed as the boasting of an old man. Your father also once thought he controlled this port. Elias sat completely still. Maeve looked at him and asked what was wrong. He didn't answer immediately. He reached out, placed his palm on the invoice, and left it there. On the desk beside it was the faded, slanted handwriting of a 19-year-old woman who had once stood outside in the cold, waiting for a door that never opened. On Thursday afternoon, Maeve called the center and couldn't get through. The second time, someone answered and told her that her sister had left with a family acquaintance. What Maeve didn't know in that moment, and what she would have known if she had been clear-headed enough to remember, was that for 6 weeks, every Thursday afternoon, Rosa Bianchi had been driving there. Elias had arranged that routine when Maeve started becoming buried under the piles of documents, not because he was worried about anything, but because he didn't want the girl sitting alone in the lobby waiting. At that moment, Poppy was holding onto the railing and walking down the center hallway, telling Rosa that she had finally made it to the vending machine and chosen her own favorite drink, and that from now on Rosa wasn't allowed to buy one for her anymore, because she always picked the wrong one. And she laughed, and Rosa laughed too, and the two of them slowly walked toward the door, but Maeve didn't know. She stood in the records room with the phone in her hand, and the only thing in her mind was what Sal had said in the dining room, that people didn't need to hit someone, they only needed to find the thing they were afraid of losing. Then a message came from an unknown number, a name of a yard, a time. Maeve didn't call Elias. She took her keys and left. She went because all her life she had been used to standing alone and taking responsibility, and because in that moment her mind held only one simple calculation, that what they wanted was the file, and what she had was herself. The warehouse was at the end of a row of yards in the South District. The rolling door lifted halfway, and inside there was a folding table and several plastic chairs. Warren Kessler sat there, his coat hanging over the back of a chair, a paper cup of coffee in his hand, and he stood up to greet her very politely. He said, "Have a seat." He said, "I won't keep you long." Maeve didn't sit. She said, "Where is my sister?" Kessler said he didn't know where her sister was, and he said it in a voice so genuine that Maeve hesitated. Then he said, "I only needed you to be here." He said, "He will come." 30 minutes later, Elias arrived. He came alone. He walked into the middle of the warehouse, took off his coat, and placed it on the back of a plastic chair, smooth and neat, so everyone could see he had brought nothing with him. Kessler's people standing on both sides of the rolling door looked at each other. Elias walked to the table and placed down 2 things. The first was a file of copies, and he said the originals had already been delivered to the federal attorney's office that morning, submitted by the person who rebuilt the records. not by him. The second was a thin, old piece of paper with curled edges. Kessler looked at it and didn't pick it up. Elias said he didn't need to read it. He already knew what it was. He said someone inside his house had reported information outside that night, and the person who paid for that non-existent cold storage facility was him. He said, "You killed my father." He said it no louder than the sentences before. Then he said that tonight he could do the same thing to him, and no one would find out. Kessler knew it, Elias knew it, and everyone standing in that warehouse knew it. He said, "But if I do that, I become exactly what stole my 22-year-old life from me." He said, "So you will live." He said, "You will live a very long time, and you will sit there and watch everything you built be divided by other people." Kessler put the coffee cup down. He said, "You think a few pieces of paper will save you?" Then he nodded, and one of the men near the door stepped forward. There was a brief moment of confusion. Elias pushed Maeve behind him. The folding table fell, the plastic chairs scattered across the concrete floor, and before anyone could do anything else, lights swept in from outside the yard, and voices shouted from the rolling door. They arrived faster than Elias had calculated, and he had calculated that they would come, because he had sent the address away before he ever stepped inside. Warren Kessler was handcuffed in the middle of the warehouse without a single scratch, and as they let him out, he looked back at Elias once, and that look belonged to a man who had just realized that what brought him down was not violence. Maeve stood against the wall, her legs trembling, and when she opened her phone, she saw 4 missed calls from Rosa and 1 photo message, showing Poppy standing upright beside the vending machine, one hand holding a can, the other giving a thumbs up. 3 weeks later, Elias sat in his office with the family attorney and a thick file spread across the desk. It was the complete list of medical debts that the Ferraro family had purchased 4 years earlier. Nearly 2,000 files, nearly 2,000 names that no one in this house had ever once read. Sal had finished counting. He placed the results on the desk the week before, and he didn't read the number of notes like that one out loud. He simply handed over the paper and went outside to stand alone for a very long time. Elias signed the order to erase everything. Not just one file, not just one name, everything. That afternoon, in the backyard, workers carried out a metal container and began feeding each stack of paper into the shredder. Maeve stood watching, her arms crossed over her chest, and she watched the piles of paper grow smaller without saying a word. The attorney stood beside Elias and reminded him, in the dry voice lawyers always used, that destroying those papers didn't change anything legally, and that the important thing was the signature he had just placed 30 seconds earlier. Elias said he knew. He said this wasn't about the law. Maeve turned to him and asked if he knew who they were, those nearly 2,000 people. Elias said no. He said that was exactly the problem. He said, "For 4 years I didn't know. Today I still don't know, and maybe I'll never know." Then he added, "But tonight they can sleep." The second thing took much longer. It took months. It took countless desks. It took meetings where Elias sat and listened to people argue until their voices became hoarse. But in the end, the Ferraro family's port operations were transferred into a cooperative owned by the people who worked there themselves, paid back slowly over the years, each person holding a small share, and no one having to put up a single dollar at the beginning. Elias lost control of that port. 400 people kept their jobs, and from that day forward, they were no longer working for someone else. Sal sat in the corner of the room throughout the final signing ceremony, and when everyone had left, he finally spoke. He said, "Your father wouldn't understand this." Then he added, his voice rough, "But your grandmother would." That spring, the old stone was removed from the front steps of the Ferraro house. There was no ceremony. Only 2 workers, one mourning, and a new stone placed in its place. The first person to step onto it was Poppy Sullivan. She walked from the gate to the door, slowly, steadily, without crutches, without holding on to anyone. And when she reached the top step, she turned around, lifted both hands into the air exactly the way she always did in the rehabilitation center hallway, and announced that someone needed to time her again because she had broken her record one more time. On the lower edge of that stone, there was a small line of writing, so small that someone had to bend down to read it. She had nowhere left to go. He had nowhere left to belong. From here on, they had a home. The house beside the main restaurant was renovated into a late-night community kitchen, meant for people who worked overnight shifts, people who drove for a living, people who finished work after the city had already turned off its lights. Maeve took charge of it, and she also opened a basic accounting class on Saturday nights, free of charge, mostly for women who were trying to begin again. Inside that kitchen, there was a small glass cabinet hanging on the wall. and inside it was an old pair of sneakers, torn badly at the toes, with one side of the soles worn completely flat. There was no label beneath them. Whenever someone asked, Maeve only smiled and said, "Those are mine." One evening, near the end of spring, the two of them sat on the new front steps, while the lights inside the house were still glowing, and outside there were footsteps of people walking home late at night. Elias asked her if she regretted that night. Maeve looked out at the street for a while and said, "Not for a single second." This story leaves behind a few things worth thinking about. A person's value is not determined by where they are standing, but by what they hold on to when they have nothing left in their hands. Amcreeness is not giving someone money and walking away. It is giving them back the chance to stand on their own feet again. No one deserves to be treated as invisible because of the uniform they wear or the work they do to support their family. And power becomes most dangerous at the exact moment it makes people forget that behind every number written on paper is a living human being, someone who is awake, someone who worries, someone who is simply trying to survive another month. If today's story touched your heart, please press the like button, share it with someone you think needs to hear this, and subscribe to our channel so we can continue listening to new stories every day. What do you think about this story? And have you ever met someone who opened a door for you during the hardest moment of your life? Please leave a few words in the comments below, because we truly want to hear the feelings from deep within your hearts. We wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace every day. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.